Hey guys, Molton here and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video I'm going to go through the three most fundamentally important endgame concepts which once you understand will drastically improve your game and also allow you to win positions which seemingly look dead drawn, like the following one, and ones which Carlsen has done on numerous occasions. So stay tuned and let's improve your endgame in 2021. The first concept is weaknesses. It's very hard for your opponent to make progress if they have no weaknesses to attack, and the two most common forms of weaknesses are squares and pawn structure. So determining how good your pawn structure is very important in the endgame, and an easy way to do that is to count how many pawn islands. The more pawn islands you have, probably the worse your pawn structure is. So in this position we can see that white has 1, 2, 3 here, which counts as 1 pawn island, and 1, 2, 3 here, which counts as 2. A pawn island is simply just separated by an empty file, and we can see that black here has 1 pawn island, 2 pawn islands, and 3 pawn islands. Therefore white's pawn structure is much better. So the question is, should black capture this knight and trade it off for our bishop on f5? And the answer is no, because black has the 2 bishop advantage, and if white takes the bishop on d6 we will improve our pawn structure, so we don't mind this capture. Whereas if we capture on e4, what happens after rook takes e4, black play f6 and rook a4, we can see that black is under immediate pressure because there's no way for us to defend the a7 pawn easily. After the move bishop to c5 was played, white played the move bishop to a3, forcing exchange of minor pieces, and after bishop takes a3, rook takes a3, we can see that black is already losing this pawn on a7 and potentially losing the pawn on c7 as well. Okay, so now we move on to our second concept, which is piece activity. This is really important, especially in rook endgames. You need to put your pieces on the most active squares possible. So here it's white to move, and this game came from the World Championship match between Petrosian and Botvinnik, where Petrosian with white played the move bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6. We see that white has damaged black's pawn structure by creating these weak isolated pawns on the queen side, and immediately this becomes a target for white's rook, so we can swing the rook to c4, king goes to e5 and put the rook on a4, where it's immediately applying pressure to a7 and potentially c6 as well. So in the endgame it's really useful if you tie your opponent's pieces down and put yours in more active squares. So rook goes to a8, the rook went to a6. It's important that rook a6 is played because now he's hitting 2 pawns, so tying 2 pieces down. The king is stuck on d5, pawn goes to b4 to defend the c5 pawn, king c4, and played the move pawn to a3. So everything is well guarded here. There's no way for black to get at white's pawn chain, and the white rook maintains pressure on these 2 weak points. King b5, rook check, king goes back to c4, and now with the rook tied down, the king tied down, one thing people often forget in terms of piece activity is that the king is actually a piece in itself, and it's very important in the endgame to use your king as an attacking piece. So here white plays the move king to e3, and the king will march into the king side here to capture the pawns. a6, king f4, king d5, king g5, and we can see that black is not in time to bring the rook back and defend because it's all tied down on the other side of the board. Rook e8, rook takes a6, rook takes e2. So black sacrifices the a pawn, but now what white gets is a passed pawn. Rook to a7, rook check, king goes back, rook e7, rook b7, defending the b pawn and preparing to march the a pawn up the board. At the same time, white is tying down black's rook to the defense of c7, king goes to e6, a4, king d7, and rook to b8. So it's very important to keep your pieces in the most active square possible, like I said. So here black was threatening to play king c8, so we stopped this with rook to b8, and now we're just preparing to march the pawn up the board. So in the endgame, make sure that you put your pieces on the most active squares. Sometimes material doesn't even matter. You'd rather have your rook on an active post and be a pawn down than equal material sometimes with a very passive piece placement. And also don't forget to use your king, because the king is very important in the endgame. So that's the second thing. So let's move on to the next thing. So the final concept you should keep in mind is passed pawns. Passed pawns are very important when it comes to the endgame. So in this position, Capablanca with the white pieces played the move bishop takes f5. So we can see that black can't capture this pawn on c3 because king g4, and now if he captures, white would have two connected passed pawns, which is almost always winning in a rook endgame especially. So instead black captured on f5, and Capablanca is going to lose this pawn on c3, but what he does is puts his pieces onto the most active squares in order to support this passed g pawn which he has just created. So he plays the move king to g3. The king is going to march into the game via the h4 square. Rook takes pawn, king h4, rook f3. So we see that white has a lot of weaknesses, but he has this passed pawn and he has very active pieces. So g6, rook takes f4, king goes to g5, rook e4, and king to f6. So this is a very useful endgame idea which you should keep in mind, and that's to use your opponent's pawn as a sort of a shield to guard against checks from behind. So here the pawn on f5 is really helping white in a lot of ways. King g8 to stop the checkmate on the back rank, rook g7 check, king h8, rook takes c7. So now we're threatening the checkmate here on c8, rook to e8, king takes f5, and now all of a sudden Capablanca with the active pieces and the passed g pawn starts to gather back all his material. Rook goes to e4, king goes back, king goes to e5, g7 check, rook captures, and all of a sudden Capablanca is 2 pawns up in a winning rook endgame and goes on to convert very comfortably. So we can see how quickly that endgame changed from what seemingly looked quite bad to all of a sudden very, very active pieces and very dangerous threats. So the next position I also want to show you is regards to king and pawn endgames. So when it comes to passed pawns in king and pawn endgames, outside passed pawns are almost always worth more than inside passed pawns. So take a look at the following position. We can see that it's even material, but black has this passed pawn on h7, whereas white has a potential passed pawn in the center. So let's say black plays the move king g6. Eventually white will run out of moves and black will be able to start pushing the pawn. And let's say white plays the move pawn to f3. So we have, let's say, h5. Let's say king goes back, we take, and a position with the king on f5. So something like this will always be winning for black with the outside passed pawn, because what happens is you can always sacrifice that outside passed pawn for the inside passed pawn, and your king will almost always be closer to the remaining pawns which you can capture. So in king and pawn endings, just keep in mind that the outside passed pawn is almost worth more. So don't trade into an endgame if you can see this being the case. So here we can see that, let's say, black sacrifices it and the white king is just too far away from the remainder. Okay, let's go to our last example where I'll try to put everything together to show you how it all works. So lastly, I'm going to tie things up by leaving you with this beautiful endgame example played by Akiba Rubinstein with the black pieces, where he wins a seemingly equal rook endgame after king d7, c4, g6, king c2, king e6. So we can see that position should be absolutely fine for white, because if anything he should be a little bit better because he has the rook on d5 and black has this weak pawn on d6. But we can see how things can change in black's favor when white plays very, very passively. King c3, f5 was played. So this can't be ignored because then black will just capture an e4 and white might end up with a weak pawn. So captures. Now black gets the open G file, so a little bit of play here. Rook D2, black plays B5, so he's fighting for control over the D5 square, and he's also trying to create a passed pawn, which is what we mentioned earlier. So white of course shouldn't capture on B5. B3 was played and black played H5. So if you're trying to win a rook endgame, try to keep pawn trades to a minimum, because the more pawns that get traded off, the harder it becomes for you to win. So G3, so F4 was played. Rubinstein is trying to get white to capture and then play rook F8, after which he creates these weaknesses on H2 and F3, which he can attack with the rook. So rook E2 was played, king F5, rook E4, pawn takes G3, pawn takes, and rook G8. So black is attacking this pawn on G3, rook F4 check, king goes back to E6, rook E4, king D7, G4. Now Rubinstein plays rook F8. So the idea is that if white captures on H5, then he'll capture here with check and then win the pawn back by swinging the rook behind the pawn. There's no way for white to defend it. So therefore white played rook E3. And now what has happened is white's pieces are stuck on more passive squares. So this rook is stuck defending this pawn. So this has become a weakness. So what Rubinstein needs is a passed pawn. So here he has the opportunity to create one with the move pawn to H4. White does have two connected passed pawns as well, but we can see that white's pieces are a lot more passive. It's very hard to get this rook to an active square. A4 was played, pawn takes, and here Rubinstein played the move rook to E8. Very nice move. After the move rook to E8, he's calculated that the endgame is in fact winning for black, because if it captures, the king is not inside the box. So as we'll see, if we draw the box, the king is outside, therefore the king will not be able to get to the pawn in time. So this is a good way in the endgame to determine if your opponent can catch up to the pawn. King D2 was played instead. And here Rubinstein plays the move rook takes, king takes, and he creates a second passed pawn with the move pawn to D5. Since the king is now inside the box, so he's going to catch up to the H pawn. But there's no way for him to catch up to both the H and the C pawn. And at the same time, the white pawns are just a little bit too slow. So this was a very nice finish by Rubinstein, and it goes to show you that you can win these seemingly equal rook endgames, especially if your opponent is playing way too passively. So I hope you enjoyed the content in this video, and I hope it helps your endgame play. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video. Till then.